Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Mr Chairman, I just follow up on some of the comments that my colleague David Parker made. I note there is a bit of a trend in this Parliament, and I won't digress apart from a passing mention onto other legislation. There is a trend where this government tends to kick critical decisions, as the saying goes, kick the can down the road to others. And I agree with my colleague David Parker that although we support this legislation, these are critical decisions which should be dealt with by the Parliament, not simply allow a delegation by regulation to the Executive. And it's interesting that the Executive wants to empower itself through regulation to take this decision. Yet a week ago we dealt with covered bonds legislation, where the government felt it was appropriate to kick that can down the road to the Reserve Bank Governor and allow the Reserve Bank Governor to deal with issues in respect of an increase or decrease of the proposed 10% covered bonds limit. So in that case, they're happy, another critical decision they're happy to actually take out of the hands not only of this Parliament, but out of the Executive's hands, the decision makers, the Cabinet, and as the Executive. And now we find that in respect of this legislation, they want to again take it out of the hands of Parliament, but have it done by the Executive. Again, not allowing parliamentary scrutiny through this chamber. And we think this is a trend which is not appropriate. Normally it's wrapped up in the case of covered bonds with we need to provide flexibility. Well, given that issue would be dealt with infrequently, any flex and a decision-making body such as the Cabinet can make decisions any time, that argument doesn't stack up. Equally, the fact that this happens, as my colleague said, very infrequently. In fact, the last time was 2000 and whatever, many years ago, or every 10 years, I think my parliamentary colleague was saying. I would have thought that there should not be a strong motivation to take that ratification out of the hands of the Parliament and simply do it by regulation. Regulation, as I understand it from my memory as a minister, is where things are required quite frequently and also required quite rapidly and are of a pretty benign and generic nature. They implement legislation. And as my colleague just points out in my ear, these proposals were agreed in 2008, and it's taken 4 years almost for this government to bring this to the Parliament to ratify it. So that proves that there's not a great rush. You know, the horse isn't sort of bolting out of the paddock. There's not a great urgency on this, especially when I think it's Australia. Equivalent legislation was passed in Australia in 2009 and 2010. It sort of shows the priorities and the management of legislation through the House. So you can't make an argument that suddenly we need to do this by regulation because we have to do it rapidly. I'd make a couple of other points that we support this legislation. There are those in this House who believe that we should be almost isolationist in our international obligations. I, for one, and the Labor Party disagrees with that. We have obligations through the IMF. The IMF has proved, I think, relatively effective with some deficiencies, but we sign up to that collective international responsibility as a global player, one that is not insignificant, but one that is not a major global dominator given our size, and we should meet those obligations and our responsibilities and be part of a global village. I don't subscribe to some sort of ancient theory that we should put the bubble over New Zealand, whether it be trade, whether it be foreign affairs, whether it be international economic policy, put a bubble over New Zealand and sort of say to hell with the rest of the world. We have obligations, we have responsibilities, and goodness gracious, the way this government is going, it may be that we may require the assistance of the IMF, as we did, I think, 6 days after Muldoon, almost did, 6 days after Muldoon lost the '84 election, when some in Treasury said, had we not been English speaking, and given the fact that we were had lost $600 million through Muldoon not devaluating, it's almost the case that the IMF would have come in and taken over to assist us. So it may be, given the economy that this crowd over the aisle are running, that we may indeed need the IRD to help us out. And there's evidence, IMF, not IRD, IMF. And as evidence of that, it's noteworthy to point out that our contribution to the IMF has been sort of static or decreasing over many years, given over the last 4 years, Mr. Chair.
Honourable Clayton-Cosgrove.
And that is a reflection of the state of our economy, given that it has been contracting to the point where, as we know, our current account deficit is the second to Greece, something that, Mr. English, who's got the silver medal, is about to take the gold medal because his own department, Treasury, the Reserve Bank and the IMF, funnily enough, predict that we will be number one in terms of the worst current account deficit on this God's earth sometime in the developed world, sometime this year. So that will be an interesting achievement. At least Mr. English will be able to point to one achievement: the worst economic record in the developed world, according to the IMF, in terms of current account deficit. We won't go into unemployment and $380 million a week borrowings at its peak, or any of that stuff. We'll just leave it at that sort of at the economic Olympics. Mr. English will be able to mount the dais and collect the gold medal for the worst current account deficit in the developed global community. And it may well be, I hope it never comes to it, that we require, as I say, the IMF's assistance to help us out, given the economic mismanagement of this crowd. But we will support this legislation. It is appropriate that we do continue to meet our international economic obligations, but I do agree with Mr. Parker when he says, given the lack of urgency that this government has put on this legislation, 4 years dragging the chain to have it ratified, that there is no excuse for future changes in these articles not to be ratified by the New Zealand Parliament, rather than the proposal on the table now, which is that the executive will just flick them through regulation without due parliamentary scrutiny. After all, we may well be called upon as a guarantor or to provide real money, and that is taxpayer obligation and taxpayers' money, and the taxpayers' representatives through this parliamentary chamber have an obligation and a right to scrutinise those decisions prior to ratification.
Paul Goldsmith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's my pleasure to speak on